Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, St. Louis Park, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP Derrigosian. We are your answer to the question, what is a queer thing I can read, watch, or go to? And today we have a very special guest who had upcoming book, Blood Loss, comes out September 17th. Keiko Lane is the author. Keiko, welcome to The Gailey Show.
Thanks for inviting me.
First of all, congratulations on the book. For folks that are on YouTube, you can see the cover here, which was absolutely stunning when I saw it the first time. And then after I finished reading, it had a whole other additional levels of meaning to me. So maybe we want to start there with the title Blood Loss and this, fantastic cover, which has two figures. I guess, how would you describe that for folks who are listening?
Yeah, so the cover, part of the story I tell about this book is that the cover might be part of why I started writing it. I always knew what the cover was going to be. So the cover, assuming I could get my press to agree to such a cover, and they were delightful. Duke was an amazing press to work with. So the cover is an art installation by an artist named Corey Roberts Owley, who was a beloved friend and is one of the main characters in my memoir. HIV positive, died of AIDS-related complications in 1996. And in the last several years of his life, he was working in painting and installation, and his medium was blood. And he worked with blood of people who were HIV seropositive, including himself. And the piece on the cover uses his own blood. He would draw his blood, mix it with a blood thinner, and then paint body parts and push them up against a wall. So what the cover is his body imprinted twice against a wall. So I was really interested in the book in thinking about, there's so much amazing political history that has been written about AIDS activism and the 80s and 90s, tremendous history projects. I have always been more interested in affective history and the emotional experience of the time and the relationships that were formed and how we made sense of what we were living through, both interpersonally and then in our own psyches symbolically, and thinking about how we were making meaning symbolically is part of what led me to focus on Corey's artwork in this memoir.
It's interesting how you framed that, because when I got the advanced copy, thank you very much, and started reading it, I was ready for a particular narrative based off all of those, the documentation that we have, those amazing literature. And so you started with the section called The Problem of the Story. And at first I was like, wait, what? And it led to and folks can probably hear me flipping through the pages right now, but maybe walk me through that, the idea of the problem of the story, because you kind of come at the idea of these relationships and your friends whom you've lost and the AIDS story from a much more complicated point of view.
Yeah, the problem of the story was writing that section was actually a trick to get myself to start writing because I was stuck. I had in mind originally that I was just going to write an essay about Corey's art. And then other people who we knew and loved started popping in, and I had to figure out what I was doing and had to figure out what my responsibility was as the storyteller, as the witness, as one of the people who had survived. And all of these friends who have died had told me sort of that my inheritance was the responsibility to tell the story. But we know through neuroscience and psychoanalytic thinking and just community praxis that memory changes over time because our experiences continue to expand in the world. And so the more experience we have, the more nuance we bring to our understanding of our past. And slowly over time, that changes how we understand it. And I was really grappling with the question of what did it mean that 15, 20, 30 years later, I get to look back and have a different, not contradictory, but more complicated, maybe, narrative or feeling about what we lived through then than the feelings or stories that my loved ones who died were telling then, because they're fixed in time and I'm not. And so that's where the problem of the story came in, of what is my ethical, moral responsibility to both tell this story and bring us into the present tense and be curious about who they would have become, but know that it's always filtered through who I am and who I have become. And part of the grief is that I don't get to know. We don't get to know. They are gone. And that's what I kept pushing up against.
As you were asking that question, what answers were coming up for you in the process of writing it? Because you wrote it, it was I think you said 10-year project.
About 10, yeah, just about 10 years. I was feeling really a pull between I want somebody else to tell this story. I don't want to be the one to do it. And who am I as somebody who made it through those years HIV seronegative? Who am I to have a big voice about what it was like to survive those years? And at the same time, I was getting to know younger queer folks who thought of AIDS as distant past, who were in queer community, who were in social justice worlds and organizations, who didn't know anyone who had died. And on one hand, that's spectacular that we have reached a point where young queer folks are able to move through the world and not know anyone who has died of HIV-related illnesses. And on the other hand, it felt like such an erasure. And they were asking me for stories, and I was trying to remember. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what my responsibility was and how to. I never wanted to center myself in this story, but I had to in order to take responsibility for the lens that I was bringing to it.
And speaking of, just for folks who maybe don't know the terminology, so when you say HIV seronegative and seropositive, for folks who haven't heard that before, what does that mean?
For folks who haven't heard that before, people who are HIV positive are HIV seropositive. And seropositivity and seronegativity refers to the virus being active in somebody's body.
Great. Thank you. And, you know, when you say that, so I'm like at the end of the Xers. So, you know, being the end of the Xers, like my sort of cohort of Xers, I don't know if that's the right word, our experience of that was really, you know, we were hitting puberty. We were already in adolescence. Like we were coming of, you know, recognizing our sexuality in the context of HIV, right, and AIDS and all of the nightmare of that, right, pandemic. So we weren't necessarily the ones that were living day to day, right, with it. We were just kind of coming in age and being like, this is what your sexual life is going to be like, right? And there was even for, I feel like the end of the Xers and the elder millennials, I guess, this cognitive, like, wait a minute, okay, so we had imprinted in our brains that this was a death sentence.
Right.
And then there was the cocktail in the late 90s, and then the cocktail kind of got like bigger and bigger. And now, and I still tell my partners this, I'm like, we were just watching TV every night, and I'm like, do you realize we saw 3 commercials for HIV drugs?
Yeah.
Like how?
Yeah.
How? And folks, like, I mean, people can, you know, acquire the disease, and, you know, between and I'm blanking on their names now, PEP and PrEP, like,
Right.
And it still blows my mind when I watch these commercials and I'm like, I never thought that would be here, but there's so many distinct stages. And where I do have a question for you, is when you're talking to those younger generations that's now their experience of it is PrEP and PEP. And, this is not a death sentence anymore, but not knowing the cultural erasure that happened. I mean, where we're at now, so many people, a generation that lost their lives, and that's artists, that's literature, that's politicians, that's activists. Like where we're at now is because of that loss that we had. And so maybe can you, what comes up for you when I say that? Can you unpack a little bit more of that for me?
Yeah. Well, those were some of the questions that were motivating me. And what we were struggling with at the time in the 90s, those struggles still exist today about who has access to medication, right? Because HIV does not have to be a death sentence now, but of course that's dependent on medication access. And globally, and even domestically in the US with healthcare inequities, that's not necessarily true. And so some of the same voices that are at risk of being lost now are, to me, echo the voices that we were losing then and the people who I was closest to. So people did survive those early years and lots of people didn't survive. And a lot of people who didn't survive the early years were, folks of color who didn't have the same kind of medication access as some of, their white or wealthier peers. And those are some of the same conversations still. And you're right, those are the voices we are most at risk of losing or not hearing in the present. And those are some of the voices that we are most at risk of losing track of as our ghosts and ancestors.
We have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to recognize a huge question. What was the experience? This is a 10-year project. You were very much wrestling with this idea of what is my role in telling this story. Now that it's finished and it's coming out on September 17th, where are you with it now? And in relation to your friends and either the grief or honoring them, like what is that experience like for you now?
As I have finished this project, there has been a wave of grief that I hadn't been anticipating, because working on this project, I have kept them so alive, their voices in me this whole time, trying to give them all a place to chatter, right? And talk over each other and fight with each other the way we used to in ACT UP meetings. And all of a sudden, when I turned in the final copy to my publisher, I was done. And I wasn't ready to stop talking to them yet. So I'm still trying to figure it out.
I was wondering that, because a book like this, it's so remarkable and searing and visceral and honest. And there were moments I just had to put it down and just sit, with it, and be like, I want to process this and not just race through the book. So again, yes, congratulations, but also thank you. For how you put this book together and the intentionality and the thoughtfulness of it. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable, and I would say must read for folks, whether or not you're, a scholar of HIV and AIDS, but you need to read this book just to understand better what happened during that time. And speaking of, how do folks order your book, which comes out in September, the 17th, right?
It comes out September 17th. The best way to find it is through my press, which is dukeupress.edu, or at your favorite local indie bookshop. I think it's available at all of the places, but local indie bookshops have always been safe homes and spaces for queer young folks, and we like to keep them around.
Absolutely. With Keiko, thank you for joining us here on The Gailey Show.
Thank you so much.
And folks, we will see you back here next Saturday. Visit us at am950radio.com and also follow us on Instagram at @the_Gailey Show. Until then, have a great weekend, everyone.